I'm Elena Martinez, and I'm not supposed to be here. Not at Ashford Academy, with its vaulted limestone arches and stained glass windows that cast rainbows across the marble floors. Not in this world of trust funds and summer houses in the Hamptons. I'm here on a full scholarship that covers tuition, books, and a small stipend, just enough to keep my mother's dialysis appointments from bleeding us dry. My mother has polycystic kidney disease, and every session costs more than our monthly rent. The scholarship was a lifeline, but it came with a price. I would always be the outsider, the charity case, the girl who wore last year's sneakers and brought her own lunch in a brown paper bag. I told myself I didn't care. I was here to study, to graduate with honors, to get into a good medical school and finally pay my mother back for all the nights she worked double shifts while I was still in grade school. I had a plan. I had focus. What I didn't have was any understanding of the rules that governed a place like Ashford. My first morning, I walked into the main corridor with my schedule clutched in my hand and my backpack slung over one shoulder. The hall was wide enough for a parade, and students moved in clusters, laughing in that easy, careless way of people who have never known real hunger. I kept my head down, navigating by the room numbers printed on the map they'd mailed me. I was so intent on finding room 204 that I didn't see the girl coming from the side until her shoulder connected with mine. My books flew out of my arms, textbooks, notebooks, a pencil case, scattering across the polished floor like leaves in a storm. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, already dreading the scene. The girl who'd bumped me was tall, with sleek dark hair pulled into a low ponytail and eyes the color of cold jade. She wore the Ashford uniform with an elegance that made it look like a designer piece, white blouse, navy blazer, pleated skirt that fell just above her knees, and the silver pendant that marked her as a legacy student. I would learn later that her name was Vanessa Whitmore, and that her father's name was on the library, the science wing, and half the scholarships that kept kids like me afloat. But in that moment, she was just the girl who'd knocked my world to the floor. She didn't apologize. Instead, she looked down at my scattered belongings, then up at me, and her lips curved into a faint, cold smile. "Scholarship students don't watch where they're going," she said, loud enough for the surrounding cluster of students to hear. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. My face burned. I knelt and started gathering my books, my fingers trembling. I could feel their eyes on me, curious, amused, dismissive. Vanessa stepped over my geometry textbook as if it were a discarded wrapper, and her heel nearly grazed my hand. "Next time, look up," she said over her shoulder, and walked away with her entourage trailing behind her like a sleek, dark comet. I stood up, clutching my books to my chest, and forced myself to breathe. I'd been humiliated before, in middle school, when I couldn't afford the class trip, or when the other kids whispered about my mother's hospital smell. I'd learned to swallow it. This was just more of the same. I told myself it didn't matter. I had a calculus exam in 2 hours, and that was what mattered. But when I opened my locker that evening, a narrow metal box in the basement corridor, far from the glass cases that displayed trophies and yearbook photos, I found something strange. My textbooks, the ones I'd picked up off the floor, were all there, stacked neatly. But on top of them sat a brand new set of the same books, still wrapped in plastic, with a small white card taped to the cover. The card read, in crisp, anonymous handwriting, "Tomorrow, don't be late." I stared at it for a full minute. My first thought was that it was a prank, some elaborate joke to make me think I had allies, only to pull the rug out later. But the books were real. I unwrapped one, sniffed the fresh ink, ran my fingers over the smooth pages. I checked my old textbooks, they were still there, but they were scuffed and worn, from years of use. The new ones were pristine. I looked around the corridor. It was empty, except for a janitor mopping the far end. No one was watching. No one was laughing. I felt a strange chill, not of cold, but of confusion. Who would do this? And why? I took the new books and left the old ones in the locker. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even know who to tell. That night, at home, I helped my mother into her recliner after her dialysis session. She was pale and thin, but she always smiled when she saw me. "How was your first day?" she asked, her voice soft. "Fine," I said. I didn't mention the fall, the laughter, or the mysterious books. I didn't want to worry her. I kissed her forehead and went to my room, where I studied until midnight, the new textbooks open on my desk, their pages glowing under the desk lamp. I kept glancing at the card, reading that one line over and over. "Tomorrow, don't be late." It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a warning. Or maybe an invitation. Chapter 2: The Economics of Cruelty. The next week was a blur of classes, cafeteria lines, and awkward introductions. I kept to myself, sitting in the back of every lecture, taking notes with mechanical precision. I learned the rhythms of the school, the morning rush, the lunch hour cliques, the after-school study groups that I wasn't invited to. I also learned that Vanessa Whitmore was not just the girl who'd knocked my books down. She was the student council president, the daughter of the school's largest donor, and the undisputed queen of Ashford's social hierarchy. People parted for her in the halls. Teachers called on her with deference. She moved through the school like a monarch surveying her domain. And she seemed to have taken a particular interest in me. It started with small things. In the cafeteria, I'd find a seat at the edge of the room, unwrap my brown bag sandwich, and eat quietly while reading a textbook. One day, Vanessa walked past my table with her tray, flanked by her usual entourage, a cluster of glossy-haired girls and athletic boys who laughed at everything she said. She stopped, looked down at my sandwich, and wrinkled her nose. "That looks like dog food," she said, her voice carrying across the dining hall. "Is that what they feed scholarship students these days?" Her friends snickered. I felt my cheeks go hot, but I kept my eyes on my book. I didn't respond. I'd learned that feeding the fire only made it burn brighter. Vanessa shrugged and walked away, her heels clicking on the tile. But the next morning, I found an envelope in my locker. Inside was a gift card to the cafeteria, with a balance that made my eyes water. It was enough to eat 3 meals a day for a month. The card was unsigned, but the handwriting on the envelope matched the note from the first day: "Tomorrow, don't be late." The same script. The same crisp, unadorned letters. I held the card in my hands and felt a knot form in my throat. This was not a coincidence. The same person who'd given me new textbooks had now given me a way to eat without the shame of my brown bag lunch. But why? And why did the gift always come the day after Vanessa humiliated me? I started paying more attention. I noticed that Vanessa rarely looked at me directly. She'd glance, then look away, as if I were a minor inconvenience. But when she did speak, her words were always precise, always loud enough to be heard by those around us. It was as if she needed an audience. And the gifts, the books, the food card, they always appeared after a public display, like a counterbalance. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a guilt offering from some anonymous donor. Maybe the school had a secret program to support scholarship students. But the handwriting was personal, the timing too specific. Someone was watching me, and they were using Vanessa's cruelty as a cover. The third time it happened, I was called to the student council office to pick up a packet of competition forms. I'd been nominated for a regional math contest, and I needed the application materials. Vanessa was there, sitting behind the large oak desk that dominated the room. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable. "Close the door," she said. I did. She slid a stack of papers across the desk. "Your application. Fill it out by Friday." I picked up the papers, scanning them. My name was already printed on the top. "Thank you," I said, my voice flat. She leaned back in her chair. "Don't thank me yet. The contest is sponsored by my father's foundation. He likes to see diverse talent represented." She said the words with a slight sneer, as if diversity were a box to check. I felt my anger rise, but I held it down. "I'll have it done. See that you do." She waved a hand dismissively. That evening, I worked on the application, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, Chloe, the school newspaper editor, found me in the library. Chloe was one of the few students who didn't treat me like a ghost. She had curly red hair, freckles, and a perpetually inquisitive expression. She sat down across from me and lowered her voice. "Elena, I need to tell you something," she said. "There was a complaint filed against you yesterday. An anonymous one, claiming that you plagiarized a paper you submitted for the English Lit seminar." My stomach dropped. "That's absurd. I wrote that paper from scratch. I have drafts and notes." "I know," Chloe said quickly. "And so does Vanessa." She saw the complaint before it went to the academic committee, and she killed it. She said the evidence was flimsy, which it was. Someone just made up a few sentences to make it look like you copied from an old essay online. But if it had gone through, your scholarship could have been in jeopardy. I stared at her. "Vanessa? The same Vanessa who calls my lunch dog food?" Chloe gave a small, knowing smile. "She's more complicated than she seems. Just trust me on that. And don't tell her I told you. She'd kill me." She got up and walked away, leaving me in a haze of confusion. Vanessa had saved me. The same girl who delighted in public humiliation had privately quashed a threat to my academic standing. It made no sense. Unless the public cruelty was a distraction. A mask. I started to replay every interaction I'd had with Vanessa. The books, the food card, the contest application, all of them came on the heels of a public slight. It was as if she was building a protective barrier around me, using her own reputation as a weapon against the real predators. And there were predators. I'd heard whispers about Isabella, a junior with sharp features and sharper elbows, who resented anyone who outshone her. Isabella had made snide comments about my grades, my background, my accent. She was the kind of girl who smiled while she cut you down. I began to suspect that Vanessa's cruelty was not aimless. It was a strategy. But I couldn't prove it. And I couldn't ask her directly. Every time I tried to catch her alone, she'd brush past me with a cold look, as if I were beneath her notice. So I waited, and I watched, and I kept my head down. I had been at Ashford for nearly a month, and I'd learned to read the corridors like a battlefield map. There were safe zones, the library basement, the third-floor science wing during lab hours, the girls' bathroom near the art studio, and there were danger zones. The main corridor between first and second period was the worst. It was where social hierarchies were enforced, where glances could wound and whispers could kill. I developed a routine. I walked close to the wall, my books clutched to my chest, my eyes fixed on the floor ahead of me. I never made eye contact. I never acknowledged the laughter that sometimes followed me, the murmured comments about my sneakers or my accent. I learned to shrink, to make myself small. One morning, I was navigating the corridor when I felt a hand on my elbow, not rough, but firm. I turned, expecting Vanessa, but it was Isabella. She was taller than me, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that gleamed like polished flint. "Elena," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "I've been meaning to talk to you. I heard you're tutoring Vanessa Whitmore." I nodded warily. Yes. Her father arranged it. Isabella's smile didn't reach her eyes. Interesting. I thought she hated your guts. The whole school thinks she hates your guts. Maybe she does, I said flatly. I don't care. Isabella leaned closer. Be careful, Elena. Vanessa doesn't do anything without a reason. If she's keeping you close, it's either to use you or to destroy you. And I've seen her destroy people before. She released my arm and patted my shoulder, a gesture that felt more threatening than friendly. Just looking out for you. She walked away, her entourage trailing behind her. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing. Isabella's warning felt genuine, but I also noticed she hadn't mentioned the anonymous gifts. She didn't know about those. Which meant she was either blind, or Vanessa was better at hiding than I'd realized. That afternoon, I passed Vanessa in the hallway. She was surrounded by her usual crowd, laughing at something one of her friends had said. As I walked by, she caught my eye, just for a split second, and her expression flickered. It wasn't cold. It was a question. Are you okay? I blinked, and the mask was back. She turned to her friend and said something dismissive, and the crowd laughed again. But I saw the tiny wrinkle between her brows, the tension in her shoulders. She had been monitoring me, even while pretending not to. The next morning, there was a new note in my locker. Same handwriting, same crisp letters, Isabella talks too much. Ignore her. I crumpled the note in my fist, but I couldn't suppress a smile. Vanessa was watching over me, even from a distance. And for the first time, I didn't feel entirely alone. Chapter 3, The Tutor's Cage. 2 weeks into the semester, I was called into the principal's office. Mr. Whitmore, Vanessa's father, sat behind the desk, a tall man with silver hair and eyes that matched his daughter's, but harder, colder. He was the school's largest benefactor, and he had a reputation for micromanaging. I'd never met him before, and I didn't know why he wanted to see me. Elena Martinez, he said, without preamble. I've reviewed your transcripts. Your math scores are exceptional. Thank you, sir, I said, my voice steady. My daughter, Vanessa, is struggling with calculus. She needs a tutor. I've arranged for you to meet with her 3 times a week, after school, in the library private study room. You will be compensated at a rate that exceeds your current stipend. I blinked. I'm honored, sir, but I have other commitments. It's not a request, he said, his tone brooking no argument. My foundation funds your scholarship. Consider this part of your obligations. You will help Vanessa pass her exams, and in return, your mother's medical expenses will be quietly covered. Do we understand each other? I felt a chill run down my spine. He was offering me a deal I couldn't refuse, and he knew it. My mother's dialysis was expensive, and my stipend barely covered a fraction of it. I nodded, unable to speak. Good. You start tomorrow. Room 204A, after school. Don't be late. I walked out of his office in a daze. So Vanessa's father had arranged this. But why? Was it really about her grades, or was there something else? I didn't have time to wonder, I had to prepare. I would be tutoring the girl who had made my life a public spectacle. The first session was awkward. I arrived at room 204A, a small room with a heavy oak table, 2 chairs, and windows that looked out onto the courtyard. Vanessa was already there, sitting with her back to the door, her hair loose around her shoulders. She didn't turn when I entered. Shut the door, she said, her voice flat. I did. I set my bag down and took the seat across from her. She had a calculus textbook open, but she wasn't looking at it. She was staring out the window. Let's start with derivatives, I said, trying to keep my voice professional. Your father said you're having trouble with the chain rule. She turned slowly and looked at me. For a moment, her expression was different, softer, almost vulnerable. But then it hardened into the familiar mask. I don't need you to lecture me, she said. I need you to explain it without the condescension. I bit back a retort. I'm not condescending. I'm trying to help. She sighed, and for a second, her shoulders dropped. Fine. Show me. And we began. To my surprise, once we started working, she was attentive, even curious. She asked questions that showed she'd already tried to understand the material, but had gotten stuck on the conceptual leaps. She took notes with neat, precise handwriting. When I corrected her, she didn't snap, she nodded and made adjustments. It was as if the public Vanessa had been swapped out for a different person entirely. But when the door creaked, she flinched. Her back straightened, and her voice sharpened. Sit farther away, she said, waving a hand. You're too close. I scooted back, confused. It was just a janitor passing in the hall. But Vanessa's reaction was automatic, ingrained. She was always on guard, even here. I filed that away. The session ended after an hour. I packed my things, and as I stood up, she said, without looking at me, tomorrow, same time. I nodded and left. But as I walked down the corridor, I felt a strange sense of whiplash. The girl in the study room was not the girl who mocked me in the cafeteria. She was someone who struggled, who tried, who seemed almost grateful for the help, but who couldn't let anyone see that. I started to pay closer attention during our sessions. I noticed small things. She bit her pen cap when she was thinking, she tapped her foot when she was frustrated, she had a habit of running her fingers through her hair when she was embarrassed. And I noticed that when I asked her a personal question, like, did you have a good weekend? She would freeze for a second, then give a curt, dismissive answer. One afternoon, toward the end of the second week, she was helping me understand a particularly difficult proof, and I decided to test her. I kept my voice casual. Thanks for the coffee the other day, by the way, I said. Even though you said it was just a tip, it was way too much. Her pen stopped mid-stroke. She didn't look up. I told you, you run fast. That's all. Right, I said, watching her. But you gave me enough for a whole week's worth. That's not just running fast. She put the pen down and finally looked at me. Her eyes were cold, but I caught a flicker of something else, something like panic. If you don't want it, give it back. I don't care. I didn't say I didn't want it, I said smoothly. I just found it interesting. That's all. She went back to her proof, but I noticed her hand was shaking slightly. She was lying. Or at least, she was hiding something. I didn't push further, but I marked it in my mind. Our second tutoring session was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. I arrived early, hoping to settle in before Vanessa appeared. She was already there, sitting at the table with a stack of problem sets and a cup of coffee that was still steaming. She looked up as I entered, her face neutral. You're early, she said. So are you. I set my bag down and took the seat across from her. You need help with the chain rule? I need help with everything, she said, and there was a note of genuine frustration in her voice. I hate calculus. I hate math. I hate that my father thinks I need to be a genius at everything. I paused, surprised by her candor. Then why do you take it? Because I don't have a choice. She pushed a problem set toward me. Just teach me. Don't psychoanalyze me. I held up my hands in surrender. Fine. Let's start with the derivative of composite functions. We worked for 40 minutes, and I noticed the same pattern as before. When we were alone, Vanessa was attentive, even eager. She asked clarifying questions, she scribbled notes in the margins, she didn't flinch when I corrected her. But as soon as a janitor passed the door, or a teacher's voice echoed in the corridor, her spine stiffened and her voice became clipped. I decided to test something. I waited until she was deep in concentration on a particularly tricky derivative, and I let my hand drift closer to hers on the table, not touching, but near. She didn't pull away. She barely registered it. That was interesting. Then I said, casually, my mother's birthday is next week. I'm trying to figure out how to afford a small cake. Vanessa's pencil stopped. She didn't look up, but I saw her jaw tighten. There's a bakery on Maple Street. They do reasonable prices. Good to know, I said, keeping my voice light. I've been saving up, but it's hard with the medical bills. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she asked, how much is the cake? Around $20, I said. Nothing extravagant. She nodded, her eyes still fixed on the problem set. You should get the chocolate one. It's better than the vanilla. The session ended without further discussion. The next morning, I found an envelope in my locker with $25 in crisp bills and a note that read, get the chocolate one. It's better. I stood there, holding the money, and I felt something crack open in my chest. She was listening. She was always listening. And for reasons I still didn't fully understand, she cared. But when I tried to thank her during our next session, she cut me off with a cold wave of her hand. Don't read into things. I just hate seeing people make bad choices. Chocolate is objectively superior. Right, I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. Of course. The tension hung between us, but it was different now, less like a wall and more like a taut wire. I could feel it vibrating with unspoken things. I decided not to push further that day, but I made a mental note. Vanessa's kindness always came wrapped in indifference, and the wrapping was just as important to her as the gift. Chapter 4: The Gift That Keeps Giving. The third week, I made a deliberate choice. My mother had been moved to a private room at the hospital, a sudden upgrade that the staff said was donor-funded. I knew it was Vanessa. I knew it with a certainty that sat cold in my chest. But I needed confirmation. During our next tutoring session, I waited until we were deep into derivatives, and then I said, as if it were an aside, my mother was transferred to a single room yesterday. Someone paid for it anonymously. The hospital wouldn't tell me who. Vanessa's pencil pushed a small dent into the paper. She didn't look up, but her voice was flat. Maybe they made a mistake. I don't think so, I said. It's the second time something like this has happened. First the books, then the food card, now the hospital. It's like someone's watching over me. She finally raised her head. Her eyes were unreadable. If you think it's me, you're wrong. My family only donates to things that have our name on them. She said it with a little too much force, as if she were trying to convince herself. I held her gaze. I didn't say it was you. She blinked, and for a moment, the mask slipped. I saw a flicker of fear, or maybe regret. Then she looked away and stood up abruptly. We're done for today. I have a meeting. She walked out without looking back. I sat there, my heart pounding. That was the second time she'd fled from a question. She was hiding something, and I was determined to find out what. The next day, I ran into Chloe in the library. She was editing a copy of the school newspaper, and she waved me over with a conspiratorial grin. Elena, perfect timing. I need your opinion on something. She slid a draft article across the table. It was about anonymous donations to the school's scholarship fund. I'm writing a piece on the rising number of anonymous gifts. Seems like someone's been busy. I read the article, but my mind was elsewhere. Chloe, I said, lowering my voice, can I ask you something? You seem to know Vanessa well. Chloe's smile faltered. I know her better than most. Why? I think she's been helping me. Anonymously. But I can't figure out why she won't just admit it. Chloe was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. She's not going to admit it. And you shouldn't ask her directly. She has reasons. Let's just say she learned the hard way that showing kindness is a weakness in this place. I frowned. What do you mean? Chloe glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Her father. When she was younger, she tried to be nice to a scholarship student, just a small gesture, giving her a ride home when it was raining. A parent complained to Whitmore, and he made Vanessa apologize publicly for fraternizing. He said it made the Whitmore name look soft. So she learned to hide everything. The only time she can show any decency is when it looks like the opposite. I felt a wave of understanding wash over me. So Vanessa's cruelty was not her own, it was armor, forged by her father's expectations. But that didn't make it easier to bear. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Chloe shrugged. Because I think you deserve to know. And maybe, if you're careful, you can get through to her. She needs someone who sees past the act. I left the library with a new resolve. I would not confront Vanessa directly, but I would find a way to let her know that I understood. And I would keep testing the boundaries to see if I could coax the real Vanessa out from behind the mask. I thought about Chloe's words for days. The image of a young Vanessa being forced to apologize for a simple ride home stuck with me. It explains so much, the armor, the coldness, the reluctance to show any public sign of warmth. But it also raised new questions. One afternoon, I found Chloe in the newspaper office, typing furiously on her laptop. I knocked on the open door. Busy? She looked up, her expression brightening. Elena! Come in, I was just writing about the anonymous donation trend. It's fascinating, there's been a 40% increase in the past year. Someone is really generous. I sat down across from her. Chloe, I need to ask you something. How long have you known about Vanessa's secret side? Chloe's fingers paused on the keyboard. She leaned back in her chair, studying me with her sharp editor's eyes. Long enough to know she's not going to thank me for telling you. I won't tell her we talked, I promised. But I need to understand. Why does she go to such extremes? The books, the food card, the hospital, I found out today she even upgraded my mother's room. That's not just kindness. That's something else. Chloe was silent for a long moment. Then she closed her laptop and folded her hands on the desk. Vanessa doesn't just want to help people. She needs to help people. It's how she stays sane. I frowned. What do you mean? Her father, Chloe said carefully, is a man who sees everything as a transaction. Every kindness has a cost, every favor comes with strings. Vanessa grew up in that world, and she hated it. But she also couldn't escape it. The only way she could be kind without feeling like she was buying someone's loyalty was to make sure they never knew it was her. If you don't know who helped you, you don't owe them anything. It's clean. I let that sink in. So she helps me in secret because she doesn't want me to feel indebted to her? Chloe nodded. Exactly. She's terrified of being like her father. And she's even more terrified of people seeing her as weak. So she built this elaborate system, public cruelty, private aid, so she could be the person she wants to be without losing the armor she needs. I sat back, my mind reeling. That's incredibly lonely. Chloe gave a sad smile. It is. And that's why she needs someone like you. Someone who can see through the act and not run away. I left the newspaper office with a heavy heart. Vanessa wasn't just protecting me from Isabella. She was protecting herself from the vulnerability of being known. And I was beginning to realize that my role in her life might be bigger than I'd ever imagined. Chapter 5, The Third Test. A week later, I put my plan into action. Isabella had been circling me like a shark, dropping hints about a story she planned to publish in the school paper, something that would ruin my reputation. I heard her mention it to a friend in the hall, loud enough for me to overhear. That afternoon, during our tutoring session, I decided to use it as leverage. We were working on integrals, and I deliberately let my concentration slip. Vanessa noticed. You're distracted, she said flatly. I sighed. Sorry. I just heard something unsettling. Isabella said she's planning to run a piece about me in the school paper. Something about my past. I don't know what it is, but she said it would be enough to get me expelled. Vanessa's eyes snapped up. Her face went pale, then flushed. She wouldn't dare. The words came out before she could stop them. I saw the alarm in her eyes, the instant regret. She tried to recover. I mean, she's just jealous. She wouldn't risk a libel suit. But she might, I said softly. And if she does, I don't know what I'll do. My scholarship, my mother's treatment, it all hangs on me being here. Vanessa was quiet for a long time. She stared at the textbook, but I could tell she wasn't seeing it. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and strained. She won't publish anything. I'll make sure of it. How? I asked. She looked at me, and for the first time, her eyes were raw. Because I know things about her too. And I'm not afraid to use them. I held her gaze. That doesn't sound like someone who hates me. She flinched as if I'd struck her. You don't understand anything. Then help me understand, I said, my voice gentle. Why do you pretend to hate me? Why do you push me away in public, but then? Stop. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. Just stop. This is none of your business. I'm doing what I have to do. That's all. I stood too, blocking her path to the door. You're not. You're hiding. And I don't know why, but I think you're doing it for me. And I think you're scared. Her face crumpled for a split second, a flash of pure, unfiltered pain. Then she shoved past me and walked out, leaving me alone in the room with the echoes of our words. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every moment of our conversation, every flicker of emotion on her face. She was terrified, not of me, but of being seen. And I realized that I wasn't just angry with her anymore. I was starting to care. After Vanessa stormed out, I didn't go straight home. I walked to the library and found a quiet corner where I could think. The conversation had rattled me, not because of her anger, but because of what she'd almost revealed. She was close to breaking. Close to admitting everything. And I had pushed her. But I wasn't willing to let her retreat into silence. I needed a different approach. The next day, I skipped lunch and went to the student council office. Vanessa wasn't there, but her desk was unlocked, and I saw a stack of envelopes in the drawer, identical to the ones I'd been receiving. I didn't open them. I didn't need to. The handwriting on the edges was unmistakable. Instead, I took a blank piece of paper from my bag and wrote a note of my own. You don't have to be invisible to be safe. Some of us are already watching. And we're not looking away. I left it on her desk, folded once, no signature. Then I walked out and pretended I'd never been there. I didn't hear from her that night, or the next morning. But when I opened my locker on Wednesday, I found a small box of chocolate-covered strawberries, my mother's favorite, with a single line in familiar handwriting, touché. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't a confession. But it was an acknowledgement. She'd seen my note, and she'd responded in the only way she could, a gift, anonymous, with a hint of playfulness. I ate one of the strawberries and smiled. The game was changing, and for the first time, I felt like I had a seat at the table. Chapter 6, The Breaking Point. The debate finals were 2 weeks away. I'd been selected as the lead speaker for our team, and I'd been working around the clock to prepare. Vanessa had been distant since our last talk, giving me curt nods in the hallway and focusing solely on calculus during our sessions. But I noticed she was more protective than ever. She'd stepped between me and Isabella in the cafeteria, making sure the other girl couldn't corner me alone. She never said a word about it, but I knew. The 2 weeks before the debate final were the most intense of my life. I practiced every night until my voice was hoarse, reciting arguments to my mother, to my bedroom mirror, to the empty hallways of the school after hours. Vanessa was distant during our tutoring sessions, focused, but quiet. She would glance at me sometimes, as if she wanted to say something, but she never did. Isabella, meanwhile, was escalating. I caught her lurking near my locker more than once. I overheard her talking to her friends about ruining someone's career. I reported it to the principal, but without evidence, there was nothing they could do. One night, I stayed late in the library, reviewing my rebuttal. It was past 9 when I finally packed up. As I walked through the darkened corridor toward the exit, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, my heart pounding, but it was Vanessa. She was standing in the shadows, her hands in her pockets, her face unreadable. "Elena," she said, her voice low. "We need to talk." I stopped. "About what?" She stepped closer. "About Isabella. She's planning something for the debate. I don't know what, but it's going to be bad. I've been trying to find out, but she's keeping it close. And you're telling me this because..." Vanessa looked away. "Because I want you to be careful. And because I'm not going to let her hurt you. That's not just a promise. It's a guarantee." I studied her face in the dim light. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with shadows. "You look like you haven't slept in days." "I haven't," she admitted. "I've been trying to intercept whatever she's doing. But she's smarter than I thought." I felt a surge of gratitude mixed with frustration. "Why are you doing this? You could just walk away. You could let me handle my own battles." Vanessa met my eyes. "Because I can't. And you already know why." She turned and walked away before I could respond. I stood in the empty corridor, my heart racing. She had almost admitted it, almost confessed that she cared. But not quite. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, replaying her words, and I knew that whatever was coming, I wasn't going to face it alone. The night before the finals, I stayed late in the library to practice my rebuttal. I'd left my bag on a table while I used the restroom, and when I returned, I found my notes scattered. A few pages were missing. My heart sank. I checked the trash, the floor, even the nearby shelves, but they were gone. Someone had taken them. I panicked. The finals were in the morning, and I'd poured everything into those notes, my arguments, my counterarguments, my evidence. Without them, I'd be lost. I called Chloe, but she didn't pick up. I considered calling Vanessa, but I knew she'd only mock me for being careless. I spent the next 2 hours trying to reconstruct my speech from memory, but it was impossible. I went home exhausted and defeated, my mind a whirl of despair. The next morning, I arrived at the auditorium with a pounding headache and a stack of hastily rewritten notes that felt flimsy and incomplete. The auditorium was packed, students, teachers, parents, and of course, Mr. Whitmore, sitting in the front row with a stone face. Isabella was already there, smirking from her seat in the front row. She had the perfect vantage point to watch me fall. The debate began. My opponent, a junior from the other team, spoke with confident precision. I managed to deliver my opening statement, but it felt wooden, hollow. I could hear the whispers in the audience. I knew I was failing. And then, during the rebuttal round, the screen behind me flickered to life. A recording started playing, my voice, but distorted, speaking words I'd never said. It was a fabricated confession, claiming I'd stolen money from the student activities fund. The room erupted in murmurs. I felt the blood drain from my face. I opened my mouth to deny it, but no words came. Isabella stood up, her voice ringing with false outrage. Elena Martinez, you are a thief. You've been stealing from the school to pay for your mother's treatments. This is proof. I looked at the crowd. They were staring at me with a mixture of shock and disgust. My scholarship hung in the balance. My mother's care was on the line. I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of them. And then, Vanessa stood up. She walked to the stage, her heels clicking against the wood floor with metronomic precision. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to watch her. She reached the microphone, her face pale but composed. She didn't look at me. That recording is fake, she said, her voice clear and steady. I made it. Vanessa stood at the microphone, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. I watched her from the side of the stage, my heart in my throat. She was trembling, I could see it in the subtle shake of her hands, the way she gripped the edges of the lectern like it was a lifeline. She turned slightly, so only I could see her face, and I caught a flicker of something raw and terrified. She wasn't performing now. This was real. I made a choice, she continued, her voice wavering for the first time. I chose to make Elena's life harder in public because I thought it would make other people leave her alone. I thought if I pretended to hate her, the real threats wouldn't target her. I was wrong. She paused, and I heard a soft sniff. She was fighting back tears. I'm not a good person. I've done terrible things. But I know what I'm not. And I'm not going to stand here and let someone else destroy a girl who has never hurt anyone. She turned to look at me directly, her eyes glistening. Elena, I'm sorry. For all of it. I know that's not enough, but it's the truth. The auditorium was silent. I stepped forward, my legs unsteady, and I took her hand. Her fingers were icy, but they gripped mine like I was the only solid thing in the room. Thank you, I whispered. For telling the truth. She nodded, and I saw a tear slip down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. For the first time, she let herself be seen. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Mr. Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he remained still. Vanessa continued, her eyes finally finding mine. I've been faking evidence to make Elena look bad. I've been spreading rumors, planting fake accusations, all to make myself look better. But it stops now. Elena is innocent. She's the most honest person I know. She didn't steal anything. I did. I'm responsible for the entire charade. She turned to face the crowd. I'm not proud of it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to everyone I've hurt, but especially to Elena. She deserved better. The room exploded into chaos. Teachers were shouting, students were whispering, and Mr. Whitmore rose from his seat, his face a mask of controlled fury. Vanessa didn't waver. She stood there, her shoulders squared, accepting the weight of her confession. Isabella, caught off guard, tried to interject, but Vanessa cut her off. And Isabella, your little scheme with the fake recording? I have proof of that too. So I'd suggest you sit down before this gets worse. Isabella's face went white. She sat down, her eyes darting around the room. The debate was cancelled. The principal called an emergency meeting. I was escorted out of the auditorium by a teacher, my mind a blur of confusion and relief. I didn't understand what had just happened. Vanessa had taken the blame for everything, including things she hadn't done. She'd sacrificed her reputation to save mine. I found her later, in the empty courtyard behind the gym. She was sitting on a bench, her head in her hands. I sat down beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her arm. Why did you do that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She looked up, and her eyes were red. Because I couldn't let her destroy you. You've been through enough. But you lied. You said you faked the recording, but you didn't. I know you didn't. She gave a hollow laugh. It doesn't matter. I've done enough other things to earn the blame. At least this way, it's on my terms. I reached out and took her hand. She flinched, but she didn't pull away. Vanessa, I know about the books, the food card, the hospital. I know you've been helping me all along. I've known for weeks. She stared at me, her face unreadable. How? I'm not stupid, I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. The timing, the handwriting, the way you always looked away when I mentioned it. You're not as good at hiding as you think. She pulled her hand away and looked down at her lap. I was trying to protect you. But I did it wrong. I made you hate me. I don't hate you, I said softly. I'm angry. I'm confused. But I don't hate you. She finally looked at me, and there were tears in her eyes. I'm sorry. For all of it. The mockery, the public shame, the lies. I thought if I made everyone believe I hated you, they'd leave you alone. But I just made your life hell. I moved closer. You also made my life possible. Without your help, my mother wouldn't have her private room. I wouldn't have those books. I wouldn't have been able to buy food. You gave me more than you took. She shook her head. That doesn't excuse what I did in public. I was a coward. You were surviving, I said. And I think I understand now. Your father, the pressure, the constant fear of being seen as weak. You did what you had to do. She finally looked at me, her eyes glassy. How can you be so forgiving? I shrugged. Because I've seen who you really are. And that person, the one who helps people in secret, who fights for me when no one's watching, that's the person I want to know. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, very slowly, she reached out and took my hand again. Her fingers were cold, but they trembled. I've never had anyone see that before, she whispered. Not really. I squeezed her hand. Now you do. Chapter 7, The Aftermath. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, apologies, and reconciliation. Vanessa's father, after a private conversation with Chloe and the school board, made a public statement acknowledging his daughter's actions and commending her courage. He told her, in private, that he was proud of her, a phrase she'd never heard from him before. It wasn't a perfect forgiveness, but it was a start. Isabella was expelled for orchestrating the fake recording. Her parents tried to fight it, but the evidence was damning. Vanessa submitted a full dossier of Isabella's previous offenses, harassment, intimidation, even a minor case of vandalism. Isabella was gone within a week. The school set up a new committee to address bullying, with Chloe as its head. She wrote a front-page article in the school newspaper, titled The Queen's Game, detailing the story of Vanessa's secret protection and the real dangers of silent complicity. It went viral, and suddenly, students started coming forward with their own stories of hidden kindness and hidden cruelty. Vanessa and I started meeting outside of tutoring. We'd walk to the courtyard after school, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about everything and nothing. She slowly opened up about her childhood, her mother's absence, her father's coldness, her fear of being left behind. I shared my own fears about my mother's health, the constant weight of financial insecurity, the loneliness of being an outsider. We were both damaged, but we were also learning to be whole together. The days after the debate were strange. The school was buzzing with gossip, but I didn't care. I focused on Vanessa, on our fragile new connection. We met every afternoon, not for tutoring, but for walks. We'd circle the campus in silence, or we'd talk about small things, books, movies, the weather. It was simple, but it felt monumental. One day, we sat on the bleachers behind the gym, watching the track team practice. Vanessa was quiet, her gaze distant. "What are you thinking?" I asked. She turned to me, her eyes soft. "I'm thinking about how different my life would be if I'd met you before my father broke me." I reached over and took her hand. "He didn't break you. He made you careful. That's not the same thing." She laughed, but it was hollow. "Is that what you call it? Careful?" "No," I said, squeezing her fingers. "I call it surviving. And you did survive. Now you get to do something else." She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw hope in her expression. "What's that?" "Live." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat there as the sun set, watching the runners circle the track, lost in our own worlds but no longer alone. One afternoon, we sat on the same bench where I'd found her after the debate. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. She turned to me, her expression serious. "Elena," she said, "you said I owe you a real apology. Not to the school, but to you alone." I nodded. "Yes." She took a breath, and I could see her struggling to find the words. "I'm sorry. For every time I made you feel small, for every public humiliation, for every moment I chose to hurt you instead of just being honest. I was scared, and I was stupid, and I used you as a shield. You deserved better. I waited." She continued, her voice cracking. "I was jealous of you, you know. You were so brave, so unapologetically yourself, even when everyone was against you. I had to hide behind a mask, and you were free. And I hated you for that, because I didn't think I could ever be like you." I reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek. "You don't have to be like me. You just have to be honest with yourself." And I think you're already on your way. She laughed, a watery sound. You're too good for me. Probably, I said, grinning. But I'm stuck with you now. She leaned in, and for a moment, I thought she might kiss me. But she just rested her forehead against mine and whispered, "Thank you." Chapter 8, The Platform. After graduation, we stayed in touch. Vanessa's father, softened by the events of the past year, agreed to fund a startup that we dreamed up together, an anonymous support platform for scholarship students and other marginalized kids in elite schools. It would connect them with resources, mentors, and, most importantly, each other. Vanessa handled the legal and financial side, leveraging her family's connections to secure partnerships and funding. I designed the content, the articles, the forums, the crisis guides. We worked together across time zones, video calling late into the night, arguing over designs and budgets with the same intensity we'd once reserved for calculus. Chloe joined us as our media director. She wrote the launch announcement, a piece called The Real Game, which traced our journey from enemies to allies to partners. It went viral again, and within months, the platform had users in dozens of schools across the country. I visited Vanessa in New York over the summer. We walked through Central Park, past the carousel and the lake, and we talked about the future. She told me she was thinking of going to law school, to fight for the rights of kids who didn't have a voice. I told her I was applying to medical school, to specialize in nephrology, to help families like mine. We founded the platform 6 months after graduation. I remember the day we submitted the paperwork. Vanessa was at my tiny apartment, arguing with me over the color scheme of the website. She wanted navy blue and gold, the Ashford colors. I wanted something softer, less intimidating. It's supposed to be welcoming, I insisted. Not like a monarchy. She rolled her eyes, but she smiled. Fine. You win. But we're keeping the gold somewhere. It's a compromise. That was the first of many compromises. We spent nights at the kitchen table, surrounded by takeout containers and legal documents. We recruited Chloe to write the launch content, and she delivered a manifesto that made both of us cry. We reached out to schools, to counseling centers, to anyone who might help us reach the kids who needed us most. The platform launched with a simple message: you are not alone. Within a week, we had dozens of users. Within a month, hundreds. Letters poured in, students who'd been bullied, scholarship kids who felt invisible, kids like me who thought they had no allies. We responded to every single one. Vanessa took charge of the funding, using her father's connections to secure grants. I oversaw the content, writing guides on everything from coping with bullying to reporting harassment. Chloe managed the social media, posting stories of hope and resilience. One evening, I was reviewing user testimonials when I came across a message from a girl named Maria, a freshman at a private school in California. She wrote, "I thought I was alone. I thought no one would ever understand. But reading your story, it gave me hope. Thank you for being brave enough to share it." I called Vanessa into the room and read it aloud. She listened, her eyes glistening. "We did that," she said, her voice hushed. "We did," I agreed. "And we're going to do so much more." We hugged, and I felt the weight of everything we'd been through, the cruelty, the secrets, the slow, painful journey toward trust. It was all worth it. Every second of it had led to this moment, to the girl in my arms who had once been my enemy and was now my partner, my confidant, my home. We stopped at a bench overlooking the water. She turned to me, her smile genuine and open, so different from the cold mask I'd first seen in that corridor years ago. "Do you remember the day I knocked your books over?" she asked. "I do," I said. "I thought you were the worst person on earth." "And now?" I took her hand. "Now I know you're the best person I never expected to meet." She leaned in, and this time, she kissed me, softly, tentatively, like a question. And I answered it by pulling her closer. We stayed on that bench until the stars came out, holding each other in the twilight. The queen had finally taken off her crown, and the girl beneath it was exactly who I'd always wanted to know. Epilogue, the note on the door. Years later, I'm sitting in my office at the nonprofit, reviewing the annual report. Vanessa is in the next room, arguing with a contractor about the new office layout. We've built something real together, a safe haven for kids who feel invisible, just like I once did. I think back to that first note in my locker, "Tomorrow, don't be late." I never found out who wrote it. Vanessa has always insisted it wasn't her, though I've long suspected she's lying. But it doesn't matter now. What matters is that someone reached out in the dark, and I reached back. I walk to the door and look out at the team we've assembled, counselors, advocates, students who've become leaders. They're all people who've learned that kindness doesn't have to be loud to be real. Vanessa comes up behind me and wraps her arms around my waist. "You're staring again," she murmurs. "I'm just proud," I say. "Of all of it." She rests her chin on my shoulder. "Me too." We stand there in silence, watching the sunset pour through the glass doors. The old scars are still there, the fear, the shame, the isolation, but they've faded into the background. What remains is the bond we forged in the ruins of a rivalry, the love that grew out of misunderstanding. I turn to her and smile. "Tomorrow, don't be late." She laughs, her eyes bright. "I'm never late anymore." And she's right. Neither of us is. The story of Vanessa and Elena is not just about a queen who fell, or a girl who rose. It's about the quiet war we fought for each other, the battles we won in secret, and the peace we found in the open. It's a reminder that sometimes the worst enemies are the ones who need us the most, and that the bravest thing anyone can do is to let themselves be seen.